Hi, it's Adrian Reed here. I've had a few people contact me and ask me how I create the mind maps that I share on social media. So I thought it might be worth me putting together a really brief video just to show you. Now, I'm going to do this video in one take. It's unedited, so please forgive any bloopers and typos as I create this mind map live in front of you. You know what it's like. It's always really hard to type when somebody else is watching you. So I thought we could perhaps talk around some of the key BA questions. So we'll perhaps start with a bit of an introduction to mind mapping. Then we can talk about really what it is in more detail. We can talk about why we might want to do it. And then we could perhaps talk about how and when as well. So in terms of an introduction, it's probably worth mentioning that there is a sort of formal history of mind mapping. So definitely take a look at some of Tony Buzan's work. However, the type of mind mapping that we're talking about here is quite informal. And I'm just going to use it in quite a fluid way and without too many rules. There are other forms available. So you might find that other people mind map differently and that works for them. There are formal ways of doing it and learning it. Those I can't talk about here. I'm going to talk about a more fluid way. So what is mind mapping? Well, I'm sure, in fact I know there are formal definitions out there, but I'm going to talk about what it means for me. So this is just a personal subjective view. I find it a really way of exploring or recording things, and it tends to have a structure, what we might sort of broadly call a taxonomy. And what I mean by that is it has branches and sub-branches and relationships. So it's quite good for situations where you are looking to, say, brainstorm or summarise a situation, but where there's that, to a certain extent, linear relationship. It's perhaps not the best tool when things are very messy, or if you're looking at cause and effect. There are probably other techniques that might be better, but we'll come on and talk about that. So why might you want to create a mind map? Well, one of the key things I find is it's quite a shorthand way of remembering things. So I find if I created a mind map, I can write very few words, but I can access the topic or the idea that I was thinking about when I created that. Now, not everyone finds that, but for me, I find the remembering things really quite useful. I also find it's quite useful for categorizing things. So, for example, if you think about a typical brainstorm that you might do with a whole bunch of sticky notes, well, if you take a whole bunch of, say, sticky notes and then you put them into themes, the question is then, what do you do with them? You've got a list of themes and a list of notes, and you could put them in an Excel spreadsheet, and that's perfectly fine. So you've got the theme and all the, or you could summarize them in a mind map. Okay? And one of the things that I like about a mind map like this is it's quite flexible in that you can expand or contract parts of it. So this so far is quite a simple mind map, but imagine you had lots of ideas spilling out, and there are perhaps, some areas that some folks, some stakeholders want to see. Well, you can just make sure those are shown, but you could, actually hide a whole bunch of branches. And tools like Xmind and others will let you create a version of that, so you can export a nice PDF. So if you think about some of the things that, if you're working in business change or on projects, you could have a stakeholder who say, well, I just want the intro of this. Well, okay, fine. Let's just show you the intro. There's more detail there if you want it. So I find it a very good way of organising thoughts into sub-thoughts and ideas and those sorts of things. And the other thing is I find it's quite economical with time. it's not hundreds of words. And I find that, I can create them quickly. I can create a rough copy quickly. So how do you go about doing it? Well, if I'm, say, at a conference, or in, let's say, a conference or like a training course or something like that, or a presentation of some type, I will actually do it live. And what I mean by that is I don't take other notes and then create a mind map. I just create a mind map. But I would say it's iterative. So you'll probably see that the mind map you're looking at right now is not as polished, it's not as colourful as some of the mind maps you might have seen me share on social media. That's because I will create them live, but then I'll jazz them up a little bit. I'll add pictures, I'll add diagrams, those sorts of things. And so the iteration is both in terms of style, and the style for me is important because it helps me remember things personally. Because if I'm trying to remember something, I actually almost think, well, that was the red part of the diagram. And now, not everyone is probably the same, so it's whatever works for you type of thing. But it's also iterative in terms of content. So I'll add things that I remembered afterwards, because you can't take in everything, even however well you're writing it down. So I tend to actually find I add to my mind maps over time, and that's okay. And also I find it's really useful because you can create new connections. And in fact, that's another thing, thinking about iteration, that's another why, right? You can create connections, or potential connections. And then you can play it back and maybe test those with others. Yeah. So all of these are quite interesting. Now I know this is it's evolving, it's raw, but hopefully you're getting the sort of picture of it. So a question I'm often asked about mind mapping is tools. I've already mentioned I'm a fan of Xmind. There are various versions. I think there's still a free version around, but I'm not sure. There's a paid perpetual version. So the version you're seeing now it's actually a slightly old version, but that's a perpetual license where you pay once and you get a license forever. But I also have a subscription for my tablet device, and that's great for taking notes at conferences and these sorts of things. So that's the tool I use. There's also MindJet Mind Manager, which is again fantastic. It's I think a bit more expensive, but I've used it in the past. It's very, very good. There is, and I can never spell this one, so forgive me, MindMeister, which I think has a free plan, and it's an online type of thing. There is also an open source tool called FreeMind. That's one you can just download. If you've never done mind mapping before, maybe start with FreeMind. I found FreeMind was a great place to start, but I've pretty soon jumped onto Xmind. I'm sure there are others too. However, we shouldn't overlook the power of a pencil, or a pencil and paper. Don't think you have to use tools. The pencil and paper or coloured pens or whatever, actually they're very accessible, they're cheap, they're more flexible than a computer type tool. The reason I personally gravitate towards a computer tool is it's very shareable, it's very scalable, and also my handwriting is appalling. So if I want a map I can share, I will create it on a computer or my tablet PC. But that's no reason why, if I was just taking notes informally, for me, I might just sort of draw it. The other question people ask is how procedurally do you do it, right? How do you actually take notes in this way? And what I find, and in fact I find that again at conferences, people sometimes say, well, don't you find taking notes detracts from your enjoyment of the session? And I take the view, no, I enjoy the session far, far more because I'm having to intently listen. And I'm drawing connections because I'm thinking, well, that bit that they said there actually related to this other bit over here. And because I've got the notes, I can make that connection. For me, it makes it a whole more immersive experience. For you, it might be different. That's just how it is for me. So for taking notes, I think as bizarre as it sounds, the thing I've learned is it's really, really intently listen. Really, really listen. And you start to find that you listen out for signposting. So, for example, at the very beginning of this session, I think I said something like, well, I'm going to talk through the intro, the what, the why, the how, and the when. And that becomes the first part of the structure then. Now, I might go on and talk about something else, so we'll create some more, or I might merge and we can move some of these around. But that gives you an idea of the structure of what the person's going to talk about. Again, for me, listening to presentations, I find that really handy because I've got a mental map of where that person presenting is going to go. So then, again, personally, I then listen for, say, tools, techniques, takeaways. I personally also listen for stories and examples. Now, you might have a different focus. Whatever you're looking for is entirely up to you. The other thing I will sometimes do, if it's appropriate and if I have permission to do so, is take photos. Now, I'm using the PC version here, and I'm using, so I don't have a sort of a camera. But you could take, for example, with the appropriate permission, of course, perhaps a photo of a whiteboard or a flip chart or a diagram or somebody's slides. And I know you can always get the slides after right, but you can actually embed a picture. And sometimes, of the 20 slides, if there's one diagram that summarises it for you, do it. Or draw it or sketch it. Sketch it and add a sketch. So those are the sorts of things that I will do. But then, as we've already mentioned, I will iterate afterwards. I will correct spellings, probably. Sometimes I'm not so good at that. I will add pictures. I'll add icons, colours, all of those sorts of good things. And add connections too. Right. And again, if you use the Xmind Zen, that is much more colourful than this version by default, if you're interested. I'm sure there's lots more I could mention about this, but these are just the things that are coming sort of out of my head, so to speak. So then, when is mind mapping appropriate? I mean, I think it really, it's in the eye of the beholder. I don't think there's any inherently right or wrong time to use mind mapping, so I'll talk about when it happens, when I've found it useful. And I think it's useful when there's an inherent structure, and you'll see there I can't spell the word inherent, it's probably something like that. So to maybe flesh that out, we could talk about when is it not useful or perhaps less useful. So cause and effect, when it's complex, a mind map is probably not your best tool. Something like a rich picture, a multiple cause diagram, causal loops, cognitive or causal mapping, or even just a traditional old fishbone diagram is potentially more useful there. When you want like a formal or legal record, then a mind map is probably not going to be your most useful thing. If you've got something that's very mathematical or scientific formulas, then maybe this is not your best approach. And when there's no structure, or sometimes even when the structure is so subjective that showing one perspective of that structure might be disruptive to the conversation. So I think anytime there's an inherent structure, it's useful, as we've already mentioned, I find it for writing up brainstorms. I have seen brainstorms written up as long lists of ideas, but actually if they're in categories. And also this is a personal perspective, there are different views on this, I find it a useful way of presenting back information on a page. And you can expand and contract different bits, so when you've got different audiences, that can be quite useful. So I'm sure there is more I could say about mind mapping, but off the top of my head, that is how I do it. That's the things that I find it useful for. If I would now, if what I would typically do now is jazz up the mind map a little bit. I'd add some pictures to it, and then it would be a useful artifact. Now, in closing, I should say that there are folks with different views on how mind maps should be done out there in the community, and that's absolutely fine. I think mind mapping is, for me at least, is a tool that is should be done in the way that's useful for the person who's creating it and for the people who are consuming or reading it. So there are some folks that would say, for example, that you should minimize the number of words on a mind map, and that's fine. I think that works well in some contexts. I take a slightly more fluid view than that. One other thing to mention, actually, just before closing, and it's something that is, if you choose a mind mapping tool, I would say make sure whatever tool you have has this feature. You can actually show connections between different branches. So here you can see, I won't actually show it, but if that related to that, I could show that. And you can also create, say, different groups and things like this. There's all sorts of different options in there. So anyway, I hope you found that useful, and enjoy your mind mapping. Do stay in touch, and hope to see you soon.